The clay tablet in Vault 29B of the University of Pennsylvania Museum weighs exactly 4 pounds and 3 ounces. Its surface temperature matches the climate-controlled air, a constant 68 degrees Fahrenheit, but when cataloguer Margaret Chen first held CBS 1673 in 1952, she reported that the tablet felt warm against her palms, as though the words pressed into it 4,000 years ago still carried heat. The catalogue entry recorded her observation as subjective impression, likely psychological, but Chen insisted until her retirement that the warmth was real. She had held thousands of tablets. This one, she said, felt different because of what it recorded. Not a king's triumph, not a merchant's receipt, not a hymn to fertility, but a choice made by gods to betray the beings they had created. The tablet speaks of betrayal, not in the language of mythology or poetry, but in the measured cadence of documentation. It describes a decision, a warning, a conspiracy of silence, and a consequence that swept across the antediluvian world. CBS 10673 is one fragment of what scholars call the Eridu Genesis, the oldest known account of the flood that destroyed humanity. But unlike later versions, this tablet preserves something unsettling: the names of those who decided, the name of the one who defied that decision, and the procedural language suggesting these were not metaphors but records of actual events, witnessed and transcribed by Sumerian scribes. Believed they were documenting truth. If you're listening to this in the quiet hours, whether it's late evening where you are, or the deep stillness before dawn, take a moment to comment where in the world you're hearing these words. There's something profound about voices gathering across time zones to examine the oldest accusation ever written, that the gods who shaped humanity also chose to unmake it, and that one among them broke ranks to preserve a remnant, creating a fracture in divine authority that the tablets describe. With the precision of legal testimony, this investigation begins with a simple question derived from those ancient clay surfaces: what if the Sumerian tablets are not recording myths, but memories? What if the conflicts, deceptions and betrayals attributed to the Anunnaki, the gods who came down from heaven, were documented by scribes using the only framework they possessed, the language of kingship, council chambers and administrative procedure? What if betrayal, in the world these texts describe, was not an emotional failure, but a technical violation of jurisdiction, protocol and cosmic law? The tablets do not use our word betrayal. The Sumerian term closest to it appears in contexts of broken oaths, violated treaties and jurisdictional overreach, the language of governance, not passion. Yet across hundreds of tablets excavated from Nippur, Uruk, Eridu and Lagash, a pattern emerges. The Anunnaki are described in constant conflict, deceiving one another, stealing from one another, overthrowing one another, and, most disturbingly, disagreeing about humanity's right to exist. These are not the consistent, unified deities of later monotheistic tradition. These are authorities in competition, and the tablets document the fractures. CBS 10673 sits in its archival box, wrapped in acid-free tissue, its cuneiform impressions still sharp after 40 centuries. The wedge-shaped marks were made by a reed stylus pressed into soft clay, then baked hard in the Mesopotamian sun. Each sign is deliberate. Each line follows the next with grammatical precision. This is not the language of storytelling. This is the language of record keeping. And what it records is a decision by the Council of the Anunnaki to erase humanity from the earth, and one dissenting voice who chose to break that consensus. The question suspended in the cool air of that museum vault is whether we are reading mythology created to explain natural disasters, or whether we are reading something far stranger, administrative records from a civilization that believed it was governed by beings whose authority was real, whose conflicts were documented, and whose betrayals had consequences measured in the survival or extinction of cities, peoples and worlds. This script will not answer that question. It cannot. But it will walk through the evidence with the same measured attention the scribes used when they pressed reed to clay, and it will ask what patterns emerge when we treat these texts not as fantasies, but as the best attempts of ancient witnesses to record what they believed they saw. The warmth Margaret Chen felt may have been subjective. The words on the tablet are not. Before the fracture, the council that ruled. To understand what betrayal meant in the context these tablets describe, we must first reconstruct the system that could be betrayed. The Sumerian texts do not present the Anunnaki as vague, distant forces. They present them as a structured hierarchy with specific roles, jurisdictions, and procedures for decision-making. This is not the language of metaphor. This is the language of administration. The term Anunnaki appears across hundreds of tablets. Its etymology breaks down as An and Ki, with Anunnaki commonly interpreted as those who came from heaven to earth, or offspring of An and Ki. The texts are consistent. These were not abstract principles or psychological archetypes. They were named individuals with genealogies, cities under their patronage, temples that served as their literal residences, and councils where decisions were made through debate and vote. The highest authority was An, sometimes written Anu in the Akkadian texts. An ruled from the heavens and rarely intervened directly in earthly matters. Beneath him sat the council of the seven who decree fate, the most powerful Anunnaki whose decisions shaped the course of civilizations. This council varied slightly across different city-state traditions, but the core membership remained consistent. Enlil, Enki, Ninasag, Nana, Utu, Inanna, and sometimes Ninurta or Ereshkigal, depending on the text's origin. Enlil held the title Lugal Kur Ra, King of all lands. He ruled from the Ekra temple in Nippur, considered the administrative centre of Sumer. The tablets describe Enlil as holding the Tablet of Destinies, a device or document that granted authority to decree what would happen. Possession of this tablet was not symbolic. Texts describe its theft, its recovery, and the chaos that ensued when it was absent. Enlil's domain was the Earth's surface, the atmosphere, storms, agriculture, and the organised structure of civilization itself. Enki, also called Ea in Akkadian texts, governed the Abzu, the subterranean freshwater realm beneath the earth. His city was Eridu, the oldest of the Sumerian cities according to the king list. Enki's role was as the god of wisdom, craftsmanship, magic, and fresh water. The tablets consistently describe him as humanity's patron and protector, the one who provided the knowledge of civilization, writing, mathematics, irrigation, law, medicine, and metallurgy. But they also describe him as subversive, clever, and willing to deceive even his fellow Anunnaki when he disagreed with their decisions. This structural division, Enlil ruling the surface, Enki ruling the depths, appears repeatedly and forms the foundation of the most significant conflicts documented in the tablets. These were not overlapping domains. These were separate jurisdictions with clear boundaries, and the texts describe what happened when those boundaries were violated, or when the two authorities issued contradictory instructions. The Weld Blundell prism, housed at the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford, provides our most complete version of the Sumerian king list. This four-sided clay prism, dating to approximately 1800 BC, lists the kings who ruled Sumer before and after the Great Flood. What makes this document remarkable is its matter-of-fact treatment of the antediluvian period. It lists 8 kings who ruled 5 cities before the flood, with reign lengths that span tens of thousands of years. Modern scholars interpret these as symbolic or corrupted numbers, but the text presents them without qualification as straightforward historical data. After listing these antediluvian rulers, the text states simply, "The flood swept over." Then it continues with the post-flood dynasties, whose reign lengths are far more conventional, decades rather than millennia. The king list makes no theological commentary. It records a discontinuity in governance caused by a catastrophic event, then resumes its administrative function. This is the language of record keeping, not mythology. What the king list does not explain is why the flood occurred. For that, we must turn to other tablets, specifically the Atrahasis epic and the Eridu Genesis, which describe the decision-making process that led to the flood. And here the concept of betrayal begins to emerge, because the tablets describe a council divided. The Atrahasis epic, preserved across multiple tablets with the most complete versions held by the British Museum, describes humanity's creation and the subsequent decision to destroy it. The text is explicit. Humanity was created by the Anunnaki to perform labour the lesser gods had refused to continue. The Igigi, a class of lesser deities, had been digging irrigation canals for thousands of years and rebelled against Enlil's authority. The solution, proposed by Enki and the birth goddess Nintu, also called Ning, was to create a new being, humanity, by mixing the clay of the earth with the blood of a slain god. Humanity multiplied, cities grew, civilization flourished. And then the tablets describe a problem: noise. The Atrahasis text states that humanity's noise, their activity, their numbers, their constant presence, disturbed Enlil's sleep. Modern interpreters suggest this is metaphorical, representing overpopulation or ecological imbalance. But the text does not employ metaphorical language. It describes Enlil convening the council and declaring that humanity must be reduced or eliminated. The tablets describe 3 attempts by Enlil to control the human population, first through plague, then through drought and famine, and finally through the flood. After each of the first 2 attempts, Enki intervened. He instructed Atrahasis, whose name means exceedingly wise, to tell the humans to stop worshipping all the gods and focus offerings only on the specific god responsible for the plague or drought. The text described this as a form of pressure, withdrawing worship from Enlil's allies until they withdrew their support for his population control measures. It worked, twice. The 3rd attempt was different. Enlil demanded that all the Anunnaki swear an oath not to warn humanity about the coming flood. The text describes this as a formal procedure. Each member of the council was required to bind themselves to silence. The flood would come, humanity would be erased, and the noise would end. Enki swore the oath, and then he violated it. The method of violation is where the tablets become extraordinarily specific. Enki did not speak directly to Atrahasis. That would have broken the oath's literal terms. Instead, he spoke to the reed wall of Atrahasis' house, knowing the man was on the other side. Reed wall, the tablet records him saying, "Pay attention to my words." He then described the coming flood in detail and instructed the wall, not Atrahasis, to build a boat of specific dimensions, load it with animals and craftspeople, and seal it with bitumen. Atrahasis obeyed. The flood came. Humanity survived in remnant form. And Enlil, discovering that humans had endured, immediately identified Enki as the source of the leak. The Atrahasis text describes the confrontation in procedural language. Enlil accused Enki of breaking the oath. Enki's defense was technical. He had not spoken to a human, only to a wall. He had not violated the oath's literal terms. The council was divided. Some supported Enlil's interpretation that intent mattered more than technicality. Others supported Enki's position that precision of language was fundamental to divine law. The text does not describe a resolution through consensus. Instead, it describes Enlil grudgingly accepting the situation because the flood was over, humanity had survived, and the Anunnaki could impose new restrictions, shorter lifespans, increased infant mortality, and limits on human fertility to prevent the noise from reaching previous levels. This is not the narrative of benevolent gods testing human virtue through a flood. This is the record of a jurisdictional conflict where one authority decided on erasure, another authority subverted that decision through technical evasion, and the resulting compromise was a permanent reduction in human capacity. The term betrayal fits if we understand it from Enlil's perspective. Enki violated a sworn oath to serve his own interpretation of what was just. From Enki's perspective, the betrayal was Enlil's willingness to erase an entire species over a grievance that could have been solved by less catastrophic means. The tablets describe governance by committee, where decisions were made through council votes, oaths bound even the most powerful to their word, and jurisdictional boundaries were meant to prevent exactly this kind of conflict. The flood narrative reveals that when these systems broke down, when oath-breaking occurred and authorities overstepped their domains, the consequences affected not just the divine hierarchy, but the entire structure of civilization they governed. Before the fracture, there was a system. The tablets describe it with the precision of scribes who believed they were documenting their government structure. What follows in the remaining chapters is an examination of how that system fractured through deception, theft, rebellion, and conflicting loyalties, and how each fracture was recorded not as myth, but as precedent. The council that ruled before the betrayals were documented ruled, according to these texts, as authorities in tension, but not yet in open revolt. Understanding this structure is essential because it reveals what made the betrayals that followed so significant. They violated not emotion, but law, the language of procedure. One of the most striking features of the Sumerian tablets is their linguistic register. These texts do not employ the elevated poetic language typically associated with mythology. They employ the measured, repetitive syntax of legal and administrative documents, the language of procedure. Consider the opening of the Atrahasis epic. When the gods were man, they did forced labour, they bore drudgery. Great was the drudgery of the gods, the forced labour was heavy, the misery too much. This is not poetic embellishment, this is the language of labour grievances. The text continues with a description of the Ajiji gods organising, appointing a spokesman, and confronting Enlil with their demands. The terminology mirrors Sumerian labour dispute texts found in administrative archives. When the Council of the Anunnaki convenes to address the Ajiji rebellion, the Atrahasis tablet describes formal procedures, messengers are sent, the council is summoned, each member arrives in their designated order, seats are taken according to rank, and proposals are heard according to protocol. The god Anu asks, what are we accusing them of? Their forced labour was heavy, their misery too much. This is the language of judicial inquiry, not dramatic narrative. The resolution, creating humanity to assume the labour, is described with technical specificity. Enki proposes the solution: let a birth goddess create offspring, and let man bear the drudgery of the gods. The birth goddess Nintu asks, how will I create him? Enki provides procedural instructions: slaughter one god, and let the gods be purified in his blood. Mix the clay with his flesh and blood. Let God and man be thoroughly mixed in the clay. The text then describes exact procedures for gestation, divine incantations to be spoken at each stage, and the number of birth goddesses required: 7 for male offspring, 7 for female offspring. This procedural specificity extends throughout the tablets. The Epic of Gilgamesh, preserved across multiple versions with key tablets in the British Museum collection, describes the death sentence of Enkidu using legal terminology. After Gilgamesh and Enkidu slay Humbaba of the Cedar Forest and kill the Bull of Heaven sent by Ishtar, the gods convene a tribunal. The text states the great gods took their seats. Anu, Enlil, Ea, and Shamash held council. Anu spoke to Enlil, because they have slain the Bull of Heaven and have slain Humbaba who guarded the Cedar Mountain, between the two of them one must die. Enlil declares, let Enkidu die, but let Gilgamesh not die. This is sentencing language, not narrative description. Ea disputes the decision. Was it not at my command that they slew the Bull of Heaven and Humbaba? Should now innocent Enkidu die? The text describes formal legal disagreement within divine council procedure. Enlil's response is jurisdictional, The offence occurred in his domain the earth's, therefore his judgment stands. Enkidu dies. The language describing Enkidu's death is clinical. Enkidu's eyes filled with tears. He was heartsick and lay down alone. Why, my friend, am I cursed? Not like one fallen in battle. I shall die in shame. I have not fallen in battle. Blessed is the man who falls in battle, for I shall die in shame. This is not mythological language. This is the documented last words of someone who understands the difference between death in combat and death by divine sentence. The text records his psychological state with the neutrality of court documentation. The descent of Inanna, preserved across multiple Sumerian tablets, provides perhaps the clearest example of procedural language applied to divine action. Inanna decides to descend to the underworld to attend the funeral rites of Gugalanna, the bull of heaven in this version, her brother-in-law. Before descending, she takes formal precautions. She instructs her minister Ninshubur, if I do not return, set up a lament for me by the ruins, beat the drum for me in the assembly hall, go to Nippur to the Echo temple, enter the holy shrine of Enlil and weep before him. If Enlil will not help, go to Ur, weep before Nanna. If Nanna will not help, go to Eridu, weep before Enki, he will help. This is contingency planning. This is procedural instruction for what to do if the primary actor does not return from a dangerous jurisdiction. The language is identical to Sumerian diplomatic protocols. When Inanna reaches each of the 7 gates of the underworld, she is stopped and interrogated. The gatekeeper asks, "Who are you?" She responds, "I am Inanna, going to the east." He asks, "If you are Inanna going to the east, why has your heart led you on the road from which no traveller returns?" She answers, "Because of my older sister Ereshkigal, her husband Gugalanna, the bull of heaven, has been killed. I have come to attend his funeral rites. Each gate requires formal justification. Each gate requires the removal of one article of her regalia as the rules of the underworld demand." The phrase "rules of the underworld" appears repeatedly. When Inanna arrives naked and powerless before Ereshkigal's throne, the text states, "The Anunnaki, the judges, the 7 judges of the underworld, surrounded her. They passed judgment against her. At their word, the woman was turned into a corpse, and the corpse was hung from a hook on the wall." This is courtroom language. Judges surround the defendant. Judgment is passed. Sentence is executed. The text provides no emotional context, no explanation of the crime, only the procedure, judgment, execution, display. The recovery of Inanna's body follows equally procedural steps. Ninshubur follows Inanna's instructions exactly. Enlil refuses to help. She went to the underworld of her own free will. Let her take care of herself. Nanna refuses with identical reasoning, but Enki responds differently. He creates 2 beings from the dirt beneath his fingernails, gives them specific instructions on how to speak to Ereshkigal sympathetically, acknowledging her pain, and arms them with the food of life and water of life. They descend, follow the protocol Enki prescribed, receive Ereshkigal's permission to take Inanna's corpse, revive it, and return. But the underworld has a rule: no one leaves without providing a substitute. When Inanna returns to the surface, she finds her consort Dumuzi sitting on her throne rather than mourning her absence. The text states, "She looked at him with the eye of death. She spoke to him with the word of wrath. She cried out against him with the cry of guilt. Take this one." The demons of the underworld sees Dumuzi as Inanna's replacement. His sister Geshtinanna negotiates a compromise. She will spend half the year in the underworld, so Dumuzi can spend the other half above ground. The underworld accepts this procedural solution. A substitute has been provided, the law is satisfied. This is contract negotiation. This is sentencing and plea bargaining. This is not the language of seasonal metaphor. though later interpreters have read it that way. The tablets describe jurisdictional rules, formal exchanges, and legal satisfaction of requirements. The Curse of Agade, preserved in multiple copies from the Old Babylonian period, describes the downfall of the Akkadian Empire using explicit procedural violations. King Naram-Sin, after experiencing 7 years of omens suggesting the gods had withdrawn favour, decides to use force against the Echo Temple in Nippur, Enlil's seat of power. The text describes this as a deliberate violation. He assembled his troops. Like a mighty warrior, he smote the temple with pickaxes. The text lists what was taken. Its silver, gold, copper, lapis lazuli he loaded onto boats. The wealth of Nippur he removed. The consequence is described as a formal divine verdict. Enlil does not personally strike Akkad. Instead, he withdraws his protection and invites other deities to curse the city. The text provides the exact curse language spoken by each god. May your canals be filled with silt. May your fertile fields grow weeds. May your rivers bring no water. May your land produce no grain. Each curse follows the formal structure of Sumerian treaty curses, conditional, specific, and binding. The pattern across these tablets is unmistakable. Divine actions are described using the terminology of law, administration, and protocol. When conflicts occur, they occur as jurisdictional disputes, contract violations, and procedural breaches. When consequences follow, they follow as sentences, curses, and formal withdrawals of authority. Modern scholarship often interprets this language as metaphorical, humans projecting their own governmental structures onto their gods. But the consistency is striking. Across centuries, across different cities, across hundreds of tablets written by different scribes, the language remains procedural. If this is metaphor, it is a metaphor maintained with bureaucratic precision for over 1,000 years. The alternative interpretation is simpler. The scribes wrote in procedural language because they believed they were documenting procedures. They described councils because they believed councils occurred. They recorded oaths, violations, trials, and sentences because they believed these were the mechanisms through which their world was governed. Whether they were correct is a separate question, but the linguistic evidence suggests they were not composing fantasies. They were attempting to document a system of authority they believed was real, using the only language they had for such documentation, the language of law. The first fracture, Enki and Enlil's jurisdictional war. If there is a single conflict that underlies most of the betrayals documented in the Sumerian tablets, it is the rivalry between Enlil and Enki. This is not the sibling rivalry of later Greek mythology, where gods compete for personal glory. This is described as a fundamental disagreement about authority, jurisdiction, and humanity's role in the cosmic order. The tablets consistently describe Enlil and Enki as brothers, though their birth order varies between sources. In some traditions, Enlil is elder. In others, Enki is explicitly called the older brother. What does not vary is their domain division. Enlil rules the surface of the earth. Enki rules the Abzu beneath. This division appears to have been established by their father Anu as a way to prevent conflict, but the tablets suggest it had the opposite effect. The electronic text corpus of Sumerian literature preserves a composition titled Enki and the World Order, which describes Enki travelling across the regions of Sumer, establishing the functions of each city, river, and institution. The text presents this as Enki's legitimate work within his jurisdiction, organising the freshwater sources, establishing irrigation, assigning duties to lesser gods. But there is a recurring tension, Enki acts, and the text notes Enlil's reaction. Enki placed in charge, Enlil approved. Enki established, Enlil did not object. The language suggests oversight, permission, and hierarchical observation. The reverse composition, describing Enlil's organisation of the world, does not contain similar references to Enki's approval. Enlil acts, the world obeys. The asymmetry suggests jurisdictional tension encoded in the texts themselves. Enki requires Enlil's tacit approval to act, but Enlil does not require Enki's. This tension explodes in the flood narrative. The Atrahasis epic and the Eridu Genesis present slightly different versions, but the core conflict is identical. Enlil decides humanity must be eliminated, and Enki subverts that decision. The tablets are explicit about Enki's motivation. In the Atrahasis version, after Enki warns the reed wall and Atrahasis builds the boat, the text includes Enki's internal reasoning. How could I consent to the annihilation of my creation? How could I, in the presence of the assembly, command such destruction for my people? The phrase my creation is significant. The tablets consistently attribute humanity's creation to Enki's design, executed by the birth goddess Nintu under his instruction. If humanity is Enki's creation, then Enlil's decision to destroy them without consulting Enki is not just a policy disagreement, it is a jurisdictional violation. Enki created them. Enlil has no authority to unmake them without consent. Enlil's perspective is equally clear. Humanity dwells on the earth's surface, his domain. Their numbers, their noise, their impact on the land fall under his jurisdiction. If they become a problem within his domain, he has the authority to solve that problem by any means he deems necessary. The fact that Enki designed them does not grant Enki permanent authority over them once they inhabit Enlil's territory. This is not mythology. This is a constitutional crisis over competing claims of authority. The aftermath of the flood reveals the compromise, but not resolution, of this conflict. In the Atrahasis epic, after Enlil discovers that humanity survived and confronts Enki, the text describes a new arrangement Enki made ready to speak, and said to the great gods, I did it in defiance of you. I ensured survival. Now then, let us impose on mankind the burdens of the gods. But the burdens imposed are permanent reductions in human capacity, shorter lifespans from the antediluvian lengths recorded in the King List to merely centuries, and eventually mere decades, increased infant mortality, infertility in some women, and childlessness in others. These are described not as natural conditions, but as imposed limitations, restrictions placed on humanity to prevent them from returning to pre-flood numbers. Enki accepts these limitations because the alternative was total extinction. Enlil accepts humanity's survival because the limitations ensure they will never again reach problematic levels. But the text makes clear this is tente, not reconciliation. The fundamental question, does the creator or the territorial authority have final jurisdiction over a created being, remains unresolved. This jurisdictional ambiguity appears repeatedly in other contexts. In the myth preserved in tablets describing the conflict between Enki and Ninurta, Ninurta goes to war against the mountain stones that rebelled. After his victory, he assigns fates to each stone. Some are blessed, others are cursed. But several of these stones have applications in irrigation and construction, which fall under Enki's domain of fresh water and craftsmanship. The text describes tension over whether Ninurta, as military victor, has authority to assign fates to materials Enki has jurisdictional claim over. The resolution is procedural. Ninurta's assignments stand for those stones used in military and agricultural contexts, Enel surface Enel. But Enki retains authority over how those stones are used in water management and craft. The division of authority extends to humanity's education. Multiple tablets describe Enki as the source of human civilization. He taught writing, mathematics, metalworking, medicine, and law. Texts explicitly state, Enki placed the me in my hand, the me being the divine powers or principles that enable civilized functions. Yet Enlil is described as the source of kingship, the one who lowers the Nam Lugal from heaven to earth, and decides which cities will hold political authority at any given time. This creates a contradiction that the tablets do not resolve. Enki provides the knowledge that makes civilization possible, but Enlil grants the political authority to organize and govern that civilization. If Enlil withdraws his approval from a city, its kingship ends, regardless of its cultural or technological achievements. This happened repeatedly. According to the Sumerian king list, Kish was smitten with weapons, its kingship to Eanna was carried. Uruk was smitten with weapons, its kingship to Ur was carried. Political authority moved not based on cultural merit, but on divine decision, specifically Enlil's decision. The Enki-Enlil divide also manifests in attitudes toward divine secrets. Multiple texts describe Enki as sharing knowledge with humanity that other Anunnaki preferred to keep restricted. The Adapa myth, which will be examined in detail in the next chapter, presents the starkest example. Enki gives Adapa wisdom, but costs him immortality through deceptive advice. The text suggests Enki preferred humanity to be wise but mortal, while Anu and, by implication, Enlil's faction preferred humanity to be neither fully wise nor immortal, limited in both dimensions. There is also suggestive evidence in Akkadian texts that Enki and Enlil disagreed about the proper relationship between gods and humans. Enki is frequently described as approachable, humans could speak to him, make requests, and receive responses. Enlil is described as distant and easily angered. His will was communicated through omens, dreams, and priestly interpretation, not direct communication. Temples to Enki, particularly at Eridu, were places where humans brought problems for divine solutions. Temples to Enlil, particularly the Ekur at Nippur, were places where humans brought tribute and obedience. The theological implications are significant. If Enki represents a model where gods and humans cooperate, sharing knowledge and working toward mutual benefit, and Enlil represents a model where gods rule and humans obey, providing labour and worship in exchange for protection, then the Enki-Enlil conflict is not personal, it is ideological. It is a fundamental disagreement about what humanity is for. The tablets suggest both models coexisted in tension throughout Sumerian civilization. Cities under Enki's patronage, Kulabai, are described as centres of wisdom, craft and learning. Cities under Enlil's patronage, Nippur, later Babylon, are described as centres of political authority, military power and administrative control. The greatest cities like Uruk had temples to both, attempting to balance the two approaches. But balance was always fragile. The Curse of Agadi describes what happened when a king tried to bypass Enlil's authority, complete divine abandonment and civilizational collapse. Yet texts describing Eridu's glory emphasize that it endured longer than other cities precisely because of Enki's protection and his willingness to share survival knowledge during times of crisis. The first fracture in divine unity was not a single event, but a permanent structural tension. Two authorities, two jurisdictions, two philosophies about the purpose of creation, and no higher power willing to resolve the contradiction. Anu, their father, is described in most texts as distant and uninvolved in daily governance. He had delegated authority to his sons and would not intervene in their disputes. This delegation created the conditions for all subsequent betrayals. Because when authority is divided and ambiguous, every significant decision becomes an opportunity for jurisdictional conflict. And when those conflicts cannot be resolved through consensus, they are resolved through deception, subversion, and the breaking of oaths. Enlil and Enki's jurisdictional war was not a betrayal in itself, it was the fracture that made betrayal inevitable. The Adapa deception, immortality denied by design. Among the texts describing conflicts between the Anunnaki and consequences for humanity, few are as disturbing as the myth of Adapa. Preserved in fragmentary form across tablets from Tel El Amarna in Egypt 14th century and the Library of Ashurbanipal in Nineveh, 7th century, the Adapa story describes how humanity lost the chance for immortality through what appears to be Enki's deliberate deception. The text identifies Adapa as the son of Enki, either literally or as his specially created human priest, and describes him as the wise one of Eridu, the faultless one, the pure of hands. Enki granted Adapa extraordinary wisdom, knowledge of all divine secrets, and understanding of heaven and earth, but the text explicitly states immortality he did not give him. This omission appears deliberate, not accidental. Adapa's duty was to provide bread and water offerings at Enki's temple, and to catch fish daily for the sacred meals. One day, while fishing in the Persian Gulf, the south wind overturned his boat. In rage, Adapa spoke a curse, "South wind, I will break your wings." The text states he had scarcely said this when the wing of the south wind was broken. For 7 days the south wind did not blow across the land. This caught the attention of Anu in heaven. The supreme god summoned Adapa to explain why he had broken the south wind's wings, an act of violence against a divine entity. Enki, learning that Adapa would be summoned to heaven, gave his creation specific instructions. The Amana fragment preserves this advice. When you go before Anu, they will offer you the bread of death, do not eat it. They will offer you the water of death, do not drink it. They will offer you a garment, put it on. They will offer you oil, anoint yourself with it. Enki's reasoning, as recorded in the text, was that Anu intended to punish Adapa for the south wind incident by offering him poisoned food and water disguised as hospitality. By refusing to eat or drink, Adapa would avoid the trap while accepting the garment, and oil would demonstrate respect without endangering his life. This advice appears protective, a father warning his son about heavenly danger. Adapa ascended to heaven. He explained his action to Anu. The south wind overturned his boat, threatening his life and his ability to fulfill his sacred duties. His curse was self-defense, not rebellion. Anu accepted this explanation and, according to the text, was impressed by Adapa's wisdom and bearing. Rather than punishment, Anu decided to offer Adapa a gift, immortality. The text describes the scene. They brought him the bread of life, he did not eat. They brought him the water of life, he did not drink. They brought him a garment, he put it on. They brought him oil, he anointed himself with it. Anu asked, "Why did you not eat? Why did you not drink? Now you cannot have eternal life." Adapa explained, "My lord Enki commanded me, you shall not eat, you shall not drink." Anu's response, in the fragments that survive, suggests anger directed not at Adapa, but at Enki. What has Enki done? Other fragments suggest Anu understood immediately that Enki had deceived Adapa, had called life death, and ensured that humanity's wisest representative would refuse immortality when offered. The question suspended in this text is why? Why would Enki, described throughout the tablets as humanity's patron and protector, deceive his own creation into refusing eternal life? One interpretation, favoured by mainstream scholarship, is that the story functions as an explanatory myth. Humans are wise Enkis, but mortal Enkis withholds, and the Adapa myth explains this dichotomy through a missed opportunity. By this reading, Enki genuinely believed Anu planned to poison Adapa, gave advice meant to protect him, and was mistaken about Anu's intentions. The tragedy is one of miscommunication and poor judgment, not deliberate deception. But the text contains details that complicate this interpretation. First, Enki is consistently described as the wisest of the Anunnaki, possessing knowledge of all secrets, all plans, and all futures. It is difficult to accept that he misunderstood Anu's intentions when he understands everyone else's with perfect clarity. Second, the text states that Enki taught Adapa all wisdom, but did not teach him to discern the bread of life from the bread of death. This omission appears deliberate, Enki gave Adapa knowledge of everything except the one thing he would need to recognize the exact situation he would face. A second interpretation, proposed by scholars examining the text's relationship to other Mesopotamian traditions, suggests that Enki opposed human immortality on principle. By this reading, Enki granted humanity wisdom because wise servants are more useful than ignorant ones. They can solve problems, innovate, and manage complex systems. But immortal humans would eventually rival the Anunnaki themselves in power and authority. By keeping humanity wise but mortal, Enki ensured they remained valuable without becoming threats. This interpretation aligns with the broader pattern of Enki's actions across other tablets. He gives humanity civilization, but civilization designed to maintain hierarchy. He teaches metallurgy, but not the deepest secrets of divine metals. He teaches writing, but not the sacred script of the gods. He teaches kingship, but ensures kings remain dependent on divine approval. The pattern is consistent: empower humanity, but preserve the gap. A third interpretation, less common in academic literature, but consistent with how the tablets describe their own framework, is that Enki deceived Adapa because he disagreed with Anu's decision. If Anu had the authority to grant immortality to humans and chose to offer it to Adapa, perhaps as a test or as reward for Adapa's wisdom, then Enki's deception could be read as jurisdictional defiance. Enki created humanity mortal. Anu cannot unilaterally alter Enki's creation without consent. By ensuring Adapa refused, Enki protected his creative prerogative. This reading is supported by the text description of Anu's anger being directed at Enki, not Adapa. If Anu viewed Adapa's refusal as simple ignorance or misunderstanding, he could have corrected it, offered again with explanation. Instead, the text suggests Anu recognized Enki's hand in the refusal and understood it as intentional sabotage of his offer. The fact that Adapa is sent back to Earth without immortality, despite Anu's awareness of the deception, suggests Anu was bound by some rule. Once refused, the offer could not be repeated. Regardless of interpretation, the outcome is clear: humanity's representative was offered immortality and refused it because his creator advised him to refuse. Whether this was protection, pragmatism, or jurisdictional defense, the result is that mortality remained humanity's permanent condition. The text's final lines, fragmentary and difficult to reconstruct, suggest that Enki revealed the truth to Adapa after his return from heaven. Some translations suggest Adapa's anguish at realizing what he had refused. Other translations suggest Enki comforted him. You possess wisdom, which is the immortality of the mind. You do not possess immortality of the body, but your knowledge will live beyond you in all who learn from you. If this reading is correct, then Enki's deception was designed to redirect humanity away from physical immortality toward intellectual immortality, the preservation of knowledge across generations through teaching and writing. In this view, Enki's advice was not betrayal, but guidance toward the form of immortality compatible with humanity's role, not as eternal individuals, but as an eternal civilization. Yet the cost is undeniable. Every human who has died since, according to this narrative, died because Adapa refused the water of life on Enki's advice. If Enki knew the water was life and called it death anyway, then every subsequent mortal death traces back to that single deception. The magnitude makes it perhaps the greatest betrayal or the greatest act of pragmatic protection in the entire corpus of texts. The tablets do not resolve this ambiguity. They present the facts: Enki advised, Adapa obeyed, immortality was lost, and Anu's anger fell on Enki, not on Adapa. The question of intention, whether Enki acted from love, wisdom, or self-interest, is left suspended. What is not suspended is the procedural consequence. A decision was made in heaven to offer immortality to a human, and that decision was subverted through deception. Another fracture, another betrayal, another irreversible loss. Theft as transfer, Inanna and the Sacred Me. If the Adapa myth describes immortality lost through deception, the myth of Inanna and the Me describes divine power transferred through theft. But what makes this text particularly significant is that it does not condemn the theft, it celebrates it. The tablets present Inanna's acquisition of the Me as cunning, bold, and ultimately legitimate, even though Enki objected and attempted to recover what was taken. The Me, Ge'ubidameshapa, are among the most enigmatic concepts in Sumerian theology. They are described as objects, powers, principles, and procedures simultaneously, tangible things that can be held, stolen, and transferred, but also abstract authorities that govern specific aspects of civilization. The tablets list over 100 individual Me, including kingship, priesthood, weapons, music, writing, sexual intercourse, prostitution, law, slander, truth, falsehood, victory, defeat, and dozens more. Possession of the Me grants the authority and ability to enact that particular aspect of reality within one's domain. The composition Inanna and Enki, the transfer of the arts of civilization, describes how Inanna travelled from her city Uruk to Enki's city Eridu, ostensibly for a diplomatic visit. Enki, pleased to host his granddaughter Samgeniuaki, or niece, prepared a feast. The text describes them drinking beer together, significant quantities of beer in fact. As the drinking continued, Enki's mood became increasingly generous. The text records the exchange in repetitive procedural language. Enki said to Inanna, "In the name of my power, in the name of my holy shrine, to my daughter Inanna I shall give the Me." He presented to her the high priesthood, godship, the noble and enduring crown, the throne of kingship. Inanna accepted. The drinking continued. He presented to her the sceptre and staff, the noble shrine, shepherding, kingship. Inanna accepted. This pattern repeats through multiple rounds. In total, Enki offers and Inanna accepts over 90 Me, essentially transferring the fundamental powers of civilization from Eridu to Uruk. The text does not describe Inanna asking for these, it describes Enki offering them spontaneously in his intoxicated generosity. When the feast ended, Inanna loaded the Me onto the boat of heaven and departed for Uruk. Enki fell asleep. When he woke and became sober, he asked his minister Isimud, "Where are the Me?" Isimud replied, "You gave them to your daughter Inanna." The text describes Enki's reaction. Enki was troubled. He said, "What have I done? Where are the great Me? The Me of lordship and godship, where have they gone?" Enki immediately dispatched Isimud with a group of sea monsters to intercept Inanna and recover the Me. The text describes 7 pursuit attempts. At each stopping point on Inanna's journey up the river from Eridu to Uruk, Isimud and the monsters caught up and demanded she return the Me to Enki. At each confrontation, Inanna's minister Ninshubur drove them away. The text records Inanna's response to Enki's claim, "My father gave them to me. He cannot take back what was freely given. This is contract language." Inanna's defense is procedural. A gift was offered. A gift was accepted. The transaction is complete. The fact that Enki was drunk when he made the offer does not invalidate it. There is no provision in divine law, as the text presents it, for revoking gifts given under the influence of alcohol. Inanna reached Uruk. She unloaded the Me and distributed them to the temples and institutions of her city. The text describes her proclamation, "I have brought all the Me from the Abzu. I have brought them to my city Uruk. I have brought kingship. I have brought truth. I have brought descent into the underworld and ascent from it. I have brought the art of lovemaking. I have brought the art of song." The list continues, naming each of the 90+ powers now resident in Uruk, rather than Eridu. The text concludes with Enki sending a message to Inanna, "You have taken the Me. You have made Uruk great. You have shamed Eridu. But what has been taken cannot be returned. The Me are yours." This is formal concession. Enki acknowledges the transfer is permanent and binding despite his regret. What makes this narrative remarkable is the absence of moral condemnation. Later literary traditions might frame this as theft requiring punishment, but the Sumerian text presents it as cleverness rewarded. Inanna saw an opportunity, exploited Enki's weakness, his fondness for his relative, and his inability to refuse hospitality, and secured for her city the powers that would make it the dominant force in Sumer. The text treats this as admirable. Enki's perspective is more complex. He clearly regrets the transfer. His repeated pursuit attempts make that evident. But he does not frame Inanna's action as betrayal or crime. His objection is personal loss and institutional embarrassment. Eridu was the oldest city, the seat of wisdom, Enki's personal domain. The transfer of the May to Uruk meant a transfer of prestige, authority, and civilizational centrality. Eridu would remain important, but it would no longer be the source from which all other cities drew their legitimacy. Some scholars interpret this myth as a historical memory of an actual shift in political and religious authority from southern Sumer to central Sumer-Uruk, perhaps during the Uruk period around 4300 BCE. By this reading, the May represent institutional knowledge, the practical expertise required to organize cities, conduct rituals, manage economies, and maintain armies. Inanna's theft would represent Uruk scholars and priests successfully learning these techniques from Eridu and establishing independent authority. But the text does not employ historical language. It employs transactional language. The Mi are treated as discrete objects that can be given, taken, loaded onto boats, and installed in new locations. The text describes them with the concreteness of trade goods, not abstract knowledge. The question of whether divine power can be stolen returns us to jurisdiction. Enki possessed the Mi because he was their original holder, either because he created them, inherited them from An, or acquired them through some earlier unstated means. His possession was legitimate, but once he gave them to Inanna, regardless of his mental state when giving, did possession transfer permanently? The text's answer appears to be yes. Divine law, as the tablets describe it, treats gifts as binding transfers. The intent behind the gift, generosity versus sober judgment, does not matter. What matters is the formal offering and acceptance. Once that transaction is complete, the original owner has no recourse. This has significant implications for understanding other thefts in the tablets. When the Anzu bird steals the Tablet of Destinies from Enlil, is it theft or is it seizure of an unguarded object, which divine law might treat differently? When Adapa takes divine knowledge from Enki and shares it with other humans, is it theft or is it transfer of information Enki freely taught? The tablet suggests that divine law, like human law, distinguishes between categories: gifts versus thefts, seizures versus authorized transfers, public information versus protected secrets. The Inanna and Enki text falls cleanly into the gift category despite Enki's regret. Other incidents are less clear-cut. What is consistent is that these transfers have consequences. Uruk rose to dominance. Eridu's centrality declined. The distribution of power across the Anunnaki shifted, creating new hierarchies, new alliances, and new resentments. Inanna, who acquired the Mi through cleverness, became one of the most powerful members of the Divine Council, a goddess of both love and war, protector of cities, destroyer of enemies, and the only deity described as regularly challenging even Enlil's authority. The theft, or transfer, depending on perspective, was permanent, and like the other betrayals documented in the tablets, it could not be undone. The Anzu rebellion, when destinies were stolen. If Inanna's acquisition of the Mi was a theft treated as legitimate transfer, the Anzu bird's seizure of the Tablet of Destinies was unambiguous rebellion. The Epic of Anzu, preserved in multiple Akkadian versions across tablets from various Neo-Assyrian libraries, describes an event that threatened the entire structure of divine authority, the theft of the object that granted the power to decree fate itself. The text introduces Anzu, sometimes written Zu or Imdugud, in earlier Sumerian versions as a divine bird, part eagle, part lion, enormous in size and strength. Some versions describe Anzu as a servant of Enlil, stationed at the entrance to the Echo Temple's inner sanctuary. Others describe him as a lesser Anunnaki with ambitions beyond his station. All versions agree on his role, guardian with access to the most sacred space where Enlil kept the Tablet of Destinies. The Tablet of Destinies is described with both functional and symbolic language. Functionally, it granted the holder the authority to command the other gods, control cosmic forces, and determine the fate of mortals and immortals alike. The text states, "He who holds the tablet wears the crown. He who possesses it commands even the Ajiji in heaven. Destiny bends to his will." Symbolically, the tablet represented legitimacy, proof that the holder ruled with cosmic authorization, not merely personal power. Enlil possessed the tablet. But the text describes a moment of vulnerability. Enlil removed his crown, set aside his divine garments, and entered the washing chamber within the inner sanctuary, a ritual purification required before certain ceremonies. He placed the tablet on the throne beside his discarded regalia. Anzu, stationed at the door, observed this. The text records Anzu's internal deliberation: "I will take the Tablet of Destinies. I will control the commands of all the gods. I will establish my throne. I will be master of all divine decrees. I will govern the Ajiji in heaven." This is not impulsive theft. This is calculated rebellion with clear strategic objectives. Anzu seized the tablet and fled to a mountain fortress. The text describes the immediate consequence. Stillness descended. Silence reigned. The divine chambers were stripped of brilliance. Fathership was removed. The crown of sovereignty disappeared. Enlil was speechless. The language suggests that possession of the tablet was not symbolic. Its removal caused immediate, tangible disruption to divine authority. Enlil lost his ability to command, to decree, even to speak with authority. He was reduced to a god without power. The Anunnaki Council convened in crisis. Anu spoke. Who will slay Anzu and make his name famous throughout the lands? The text describes several gods declining the mission. Adad, god of storms, refused. Whoever holds the tablet commands even my winds. Gira, god of fire, refused. Whoever possesses it can turn my flames against me. Shara, a warrior god, refused. His fortress is impregnable, and he commands destiny itself. Finally, Ninurta Enlil's son, god of war and agriculture, accepted the mission. But even Ninurta recognized the problem. How do you fight someone who can command your weapons, control your strategy, and decree your defeat by holding the tablet? The text describes Ea Enki's Akkadian Noma providing Ninurta with a solution, a weapon that could split Anzu's defences, described in terms that combine natural and technological imagery, arrows that Anzu could not see, winds that could not be commanded, a strategy that bypassed the tablets. Authority. The battle between Ninurta and Anzu spans multiple tablets and describes extended combat. Ninurta fired arrows. Anzu commanded them to return to their quiver. Ninurta summoned storm winds. Anzu decreed they reverse direction. The text emphasizes the futility of conventional warfare against someone wielding the tablet's authority. E's weapon, described with fragmentary and difficult to translate terminology, appears to have involved attacking Anzu's wings rather than his body. The text states, "Strike the pinions of his wings. Let right and left be severed. When he sees his wings flutter helplessly, he will cry out, 'My wings, my wings.' At that moment, strike with your blade. The tablet will fall from his grasp." Ninurta executed this strategy. Anzu's wings were disabled. The tablet fell. Ninurta seized it and killed Anzu. The text describes Ninurta returning to the Eku with the tablet, restoring it to Enlil, and receiving honours for his service. The divine order was restored. But the incident revealed a structural vulnerability. The entire authority of the Anunnaki rested on a physical object that could be stolen. While Anzu held the tablet, he was effectively supreme, even though he lacked the wisdom, experience, or legitimate claim to use that power effectively. The tablet itself granted authority independent of the worthiness of its holder. This raises questions the tablets do not answer. What would have happened if Anzu had possessed the tablet for years rather than weeks? Could he have consolidated power, commanded the loyalty of lesser gods, and established a new regime? The text suggests yes, that possession alone, given sufficient time, would have legitimized his rule simply because no one could challenge someone who controlled destiny itself. The theological implications are significant. If divine authority rests on possession of objects rather than inherent qualities, then the stability of that authority depends on security measures, not moral superiority or cosmic deservingness. The tablets describe Enlil as king not because he is the wisest, strongest, or most just, but because he holds the tablet. Remove the tablet, remove his authority. This is governance by artifact, not by mandate. And it suggests the Anunnaki themselves understood their authority as procedural and technical, not essential and permanent. The Anzu myth also reveals something about divine vulnerability. Enlil, the most powerful of the surface-dwelling Anunnaki, was vulnerable while performing a ritual purification. He removed his defences, crown, garments, tablet, to fulfill religious requirements. This suggests even the gods were bound by protocols they could not bypass without consequence. Enlil could not skip the purification ritual. He could not wear the crown and hold the tablet while bathing. The rules applied to him as surely as they applied to humans. Anzu exploited that moment of protocol-mandated vulnerability. In human terms, this is equivalent to attacking a king while he fulfills a religious obligation he cannot delegate or postpone. The act is condemnable precisely because it violates the understanding that ritual moments are protected time. Anzu violated that protection. Yet the text also suggests that Anzu's rebellion was not entirely without sympathizers. Some versions include fragments suggesting certain gods were slow to offer help recovering the tablet, waiting to see if Anzu could maintain control. If he could, perhaps his rule would be accepted as the new order. Only when it became clear he could not defend himself effectively, when Ninurta developed a counter-strategy, did consensus form around restoration of Enlil's authority. This suggests pragmatism, not principle. The Anunnaki supported whoever held the tablet because opposing the tablet's holder was functionally impossible. Authority flowed from possession, and possession created legitimacy through the brute fact of control. The tablets do not celebrate this system, they describe it. And in describing it, they reveal a divine order more fragile than later theological traditions would suggest, an order dependent on security, military strength, strategic wisdom, and the willingness of ambitious subordinates to accept their place in the hierarchy. Anzu did not accept his place. For that, he was killed, and the tablet was returned to its vault, guarded more carefully, stored more securely, and held more tightly by a god who now understood that his authority was only as secure as the object that symbolized it. Sister against sister, Inanna's descent, and Ereshkigal's judgment. The descent of Inanna to the underworld is among the most haunting texts in the Sumerian corpus. Unlike the Anzu theft or the Me transfer, this incident describes betrayal within family, sister against sister, and reveals the absolute jurisdiction of the underworld as a realm even the most powerful Anunnaki could not violate with impunity. The text opens with Inanna's decision to descend. She set her mind toward the great below. The reason given varies across tablet versions. Some state she went to attend the funeral rites of Gugalana, the bull of heaven, who had been killed by Gilgamesh in Enkidu. Gugalana was, in some traditions, the consort of Ereshkigal-Nanna's older sister, making the funeral a family obligation. Other versions suggest Inanna's motives were less pure, that she descended to challenge Ereshkigal's authority and perhaps expand her own domain to include rulership of the dead. Before descending, Inanna took careful precautions. She dressed in her 7 divine garments and wore her crown, jewellery, and implements of power. She instructed her minister Ninshaba with contingency plans. If 3 days passed without her return, Ninshaba was to mourn publicly, then go to Enlil, then to Nanna, and finally to Enki, seeking someone who would intervene to rescue her. The journey through the underworld involves 7 gates. At each gate, Inanna is challenged by the gatekeeper. Who are you? I am Inanna, going to the east. For what reason? To attend the funeral rites of Gugalana. At each gate, the gatekeeper informs her, enter, but the rules of the underworld must be fulfilled. Each rule requires the removal of 1 article of her divine regalia, her crown, her necklace, her breastplate, her ring, her rod and measuring line, her garment. By the time Inanna reaches the throne room, she is naked and powerless. The text states, she entered bowed low. This is submission language. Inanna, goddess of heaven, love and war, holder of the me, protector of Uruk, commander of divine authority, entered the throne room of the underworld as a supplicant with no power. Ereshkigal sat on her throne. The text describes her as surrounded by the Anunnaki of the underworld, 7 judges whose role was to pass judgment on those who entered the realm of the dead. The text does not describe a trial. It does not describe accusations or defence. It states simply, the Anunnaki, the 7 judges of the underworld, surrounded her. They looked at her. At their word, she was turned into a corpse. The corpse was hung from a hook on the wall. Inanna was executed and displayed. No explanation is given for the crime. No justification is offered for the sentence. She entered Ereshkigal's jurisdiction, and Ereshkigal had her killed. 3 days passed. Ninshaba followed Inanna's instructions exactly. She mourned publicly, beating the drum in Uruk's assembly hall, tearing her clothes, and announcing that Inanna had not returned from the underworld. She went to Nippur and pleaded with Enlil, do not let your daughter be put to death in the underworld. Do not let your good metal be covered with the dust of the underworld. Do not let your precious lapis lazuli be split with the woodworker's stone. Enlil refused. My daughter asked for the great below. She asked for the great above. Inanna asked for the underworld. The divine powers of the underworld are not to be approached. Whoever goes to that place goes of their own accord. Who am I to interfere? Ninshaba went to Ul and pleaded with Nanna, the moon god, Anunna's father, in most traditions. He gave the same answer, she went of her own will, the underworld has its own laws, I will not interfere. Finally, Ninshaba went to Eridu and pleaded with Enki. The text describes his different response. What has happened to my daughter? I am troubled. What has happened to Inanna, the holy priestess of heaven? Enki took action. He created 2 beings from the dirt beneath his fingernails, genderless creatures who could slip through the cracks between worlds. He gave them the food of life and the water of life, and instructed them on how to speak to Ereshkigal. She will be moaning like a woman in childbirth. Say to her, you are troubled, my queen. Your heart is in distress. She will be pleased. She will offer you a gift. Ask for nothing but the corpse on the hook. The plan succeeded. The 2 beings descended, found Ereshkigal in pain. The text suggests grief over her consort's death, offered sympathy, and when she offered them a reward, they asked for Inanna's corpse. Ereshkigal granted it. They sprinkled the food and water of life on the corpse. Inanna revived. But as she prepared to ascend, the underworld judges declared a law: no one ascends from the underworld unmarked. If Inanna ascends, she must provide a substitute. Someone must take her place. Inanna agreed. She returned to the surface, accompanied by demons whose task was to seize the substitute. Everywhere Inanna went, those who loved her were mourning, wearing funeral clothes, sitting in dust, weeping for her absence. The demons approached each mourner, but Inanna said, no, not that one. They mourned me. Then Inanna arrived in Uruk and found Dumuzi, her consort, sitting on her throne. He wore fine clothes. He had not mourned. The text describes Inanna's fury in procedural language. She looked at him with the eye of death. She spoke to him with the word of wrath. She cried out against him with the cry of guilt. Take this one. The demons seized Dumuzi. The text describes his desperate flight, his sister Geshtinanna's attempts to protect him, and eventually his capture. But Geshtinanna offered a compromise. Let me take his place for half the year. Let him take my place the other half. The underworld accepted this arrangement. Dumuzi would spend 6 months in the underworld, 6 months above. His sister would spend 6 months in the underworld, 6 months above. They would alternate, ensuring a substitute was always present to fulfill the law. The text concludes with acknowledgement of this pattern as permanent. Dumuzi died. Geshtinanna mourned. Half the year he walks in the world above, half the year he dwells in the world below. Thus it is decreed. Later traditions would interpret this as seasonal metaphor. Dumuzi representing vegetation that dies in summer and returns in winter. But the tablets do not employ metaphorical language. They describe legal requirements, substitute arrangements, and permanent alternation mandated by underworld law. The betrayal operates on multiple levels. Inanna descended for reasons the text leaves ambiguous, family obligation or power grab. Either way, she entered a jurisdiction that was not hers. Ereshkigal had her executed not for any crime, but simply for entering. This is sovereignty expressed as absolute territorial control. Enter my realm, face my judgment. No external authority can intervene. When Inanna escaped through Enki's interven, she was required to send someone else in her place. Her choice of Dumuzi, her consort, who failed to mourn, is presented as justified anger, but it transferred the underworld's claim from herself to someone who had not chosen to descend. Dumuzi's crime was insensitivity, not trespass, yet he received the same punishment Inanna had, death and underworld imprisonment. The question of which sister betrayed whom depends on perspective. From Ereshkigal's perspective, Inanna violated underworld sovereignty by descending without permission, then violated it again by escaping without fulfilling the law. From Inanna's perspective, Ereshkigal executed her without justification or trial and imposed requirements designed to harm those Inanna loved. The text does not resolve this. Both sisters acted within their jurisdictional authority. Ereshkigal ruled the underworld. She had the right to execute those who entered. Inanna ruled the surface. She had the right to choose who would serve as her substitute. But the exercise of these rights destroyed the relationship between them, imposed permanent suffering on Dumuzi and Geshtinanna, and created a cycle of alternating presence and absence that could never be resolved. The tablets suggest that when jurisdictions are absolute and authorities uncompromising, even family bonds fracture under the weight of law. Ereshkigal and Inanna were sisters. The texts describing other contexts show them as part of the same divine family, attending the same councils, acknowledging the same father. But in the underworld, family meant nothing. Jurisdiction meant everything. The lesson encoded in this narrative is that divine law operated without exception. Even the powerful could not bypass it. Even the loved could not evade it. Even family could not soften it. The system the tablets describe is one where authority structures supersede all other considerations, a cosmos governed by procedure, not mercy, the marriage of coercion, Nergal and Ereshkigal. The relationship between Ereshkigal and her eventual consort Nergal provides another angle on underworld sovereignty and the tensions between divine jurisdictions. The tablets describing this relationship, including a relatively complete version on British Museum tablet 1888, Wen 13, 69, present a narrative that begins with insult, escalates to violence, and concludes with an arranged marriage that appears more like negotiated hostage-taking than love. The text opens with a banquet in heaven. All the Anunnaki assembled at Anu's invitation to feast. Ereshkigal, as queen of the underworld, could not attend. She was bound to her realm and could not leave. Instead, she sent a representative, her vizier Namtar, to receive her portion of the feast and convey her greetings. When Namtar entered the assembly, all the gods stood to show respect, all except Nergal. He remained seated. The text describes this as deliberate insult. Nergal alone did not rise. Namtar noticed this and returned to the underworld. He reported to Ereshkigal, "One god did not rise. One god did not honour you." Ereshkigal's response was immediate. "Go, bring me that god. I will kill him." This is not a request for apology. This is a sentence for disrespect. Nergal had violated protocol by refusing to stand for Ereshkigal's representative, and underworld law demanded his death. Namtar returned to heaven and demanded Nergal's surrender. The gods were troubled. Nergal was a powerful warrior god associated with plague, war and destruction, not someone who could be easily compelled. But Anu declared that Nergal must descend to face Ereshkigal's judgment. "You committed the offence. You must answer for it," Eaim intervened, not to cancel Nergal's descent, but to give him advice. "When you descend, follow these instructions precisely. At each gate, when they demand the removal of your weapons and regalia, refuse. Fight your way through if necessary. When you reach the throne room, overpower Ereshkigal before she can command the judges to kill you. Seize her by the hair, drag her from the throne, and threaten her life. Do not kill her, but make her understand you are more powerful than she is. Then negotiate." The text describes Nergal following these instructions exactly. He descended armed and refused to disarm at any of the 7 gates. When guards tried to stop him, he overpowered them. When he reached the throne room, he seized Ereshkigal before she could speak, pulled her from her throne by her hair, and held a blade to her throat. The text records her words, "Do not kill me, my brother. Let me speak." Nergal held the blade steady. Ereshkigal continued, "You are strong. You have defeated my guards. You have overcome my threshold. You have reached my throne. But if you kill me, the underworld will have no ruler. The dead will rise. Chaos will spread. You cannot rule the underworld from heaven, and you cannot abandon the underworld to disorder. This is pragmatic negotiation under threat." Ereshkigal did not plead or appeal to mercy. She outlined practical consequences. Nergal could kill her, but doing so would create a crisis he was not positioned to solve. Nergal's response, as the text records it, was equally pragmatic: "Then share the throne. Make me your consort. We will rule together." The text does not describe this as romantic proposal. It describes it as dictated terms. Ereshkigal agreed, but she imposed a condition: 6 months above, 6 months below. "You will dwell with me half the year. You will return to heaven half the year. Thus we will share both throne and time." Nergal accepted. The text describes them seizing each other and embracing, language that could be read as affection or as struggle resolving into truce. They enjoyed each other for 6 days and 6 nights, and on the 7th day Nergal departed for the surface. But when he reached heaven, he did not return. The text describes months passing. Ereshkigal sent Namtar again, this time to demand Nergal's return according to their agreement. The gods responded, "Nergal is not here." Whether this was true or protective lie, the text does not clarify. Ereshkigal's response was grief turning to rage. One version of the text describes her mourning, "He has shamed me. He used me and abandoned me." Another version describes her threatening, "I will release the dead. They will outnumber the living. I will destroy the balance between worlds unless my consort is returned." Faced with this ultimatum, Anu commanded Nergal to return. Nergal descended again, this time permanently. The text concludes, "He took his seat on the throne. He grasped Ereshkigal's hand. He kissed her. He wiped away her tears. 'Do not grieve. I am here. I will dwell with you. What you wish shall be.'" Thus Nergal and Ereshkigal share the throne of the underworld. The narrative ends with formal resolution, but the emotional content is ambiguous. Is this reconciliation or resignation? Did Nergal return willingly or only under divine command and threat of cosmic catastrophe? Did Ereshkigal accept him out of love, or because she needed a partner powerful enough to share governance of an otherwise ungovernable realm? The text does not answer these questions, because they are not the text's concern. The text documents procedure, insult, violation, confrontation, negotiation, agreement, breach, enforcement, resolution. The emotional states of the participants are noted but not analysed. What matters is that the underworld has two rulers now instead of one, that Nergal is bound to spend at least half his time there, and that Ereshkigal has secured a consort who can neither be dismissed nor dominated. This is marriage as power-sharing agreement between near equals who could not defeat each other outright. Nergal could seize the throne, but could not abandon it without consequences. Ereshkigal could not remove Nergal by force, but could threaten systemic collapse if he left permanently. The result is a binding arrangement neither chose freely, but both agreed to under duress. The tablets suggest this was considered a successful resolution. Nergal and Ereshkigal ruled the underworld together for the remainder of recorded Mesopotamian history. Later texts describe them as a functioning partnership, with Nergal handling military and plague matters, while Ereshkigal handled judicial and administrative matters. They divided the labour of ruling the dead, but the origin of that partnership was violence, coercion, and threatened catastrophe. It was not betrayal in the sense of broken promises, no promises had been made. It was betrayal in the sense of violated expectations. Nergal was expected to honour divine protocol, failed to do so, responded to the consequence with overwhelming force, imposed terms on a sovereign ruler in her own realm, and then attempted to abandon the agreement when it became inconvenient. That he was ultimately forced to honour it suggests divine law had mechanisms for enforcement. Anu could command even powerful gods like Nergal. The threat of releasing the dead was credible enough to compel action, and once an agreement was made, even an agreement coerced at blade point, it was binding. The underworld in these tablets is portrayed not as a place of punishment for the wicked, but as a separate jurisdiction with its own laws, its own sovereignty, and its own vulnerabilities. Ereshkigal's power was absolute within her realm, but dependent on cooperation from the other Anunnaki to maintain boundaries. When Nergal violated those boundaries through force, he could not be expelled. He was too powerful. The only solution was to incorporate him into the governance structure, turning a threat into a partner. This pattern, turning violation into binding partnership, appears in multiple divine relationships documented in the tablets. It suggests a pragmatic approach to power where permanent conflict is more costly than forced cooperation, and where even coerced agreements are preferable to ongoing instability. The marriage of Nergal and Ereshkigal is one of divine law adapting to reality. What cannot be prevented must be regulated, and what cannot be undone must be formalized. The flood decision, ultimate betrayal of humanity. No episode in the Sumerian tablets has generated more interpretive debate than the flood narrative. Preserved across multiple versions, the Eridu Genesis CBS 0673, the Atrahasis Epic British Museum 1989 0426-236, and portions of the Gilgamesh Epic, these texts describe a decision by the Anunnaki Council to erase humanity from existence, and one God's choice to defy that decision. The question these tablets pose is which party committed the greater betrayal, Enlil, who sought to destroy his own creations, or Enki, who violated his oath to save them. The Atrahasis version provides the most complete account of the decision-making process. The text describes humanity's proliferation after their creation. Cities grew, populations expanded, noise increased. The term noise in Akkadian, Ugu in Sumerian, appears repeatedly, and scholars debate its meaning. Literal translation suggests sound, the daily activity of humanity. Metaphorical interpretation suggests ecological disruption, resource overconsumption, or spiritual disorder. The text records Enlil's complaint: the noise of mankind has become too intense. With their uproar I am deprived of sleep. Cut off food supplies from the people. Let them be short of plant life. let famine grip them. This is described as the first attempt to reduce human population through agricultural collapse and resulting starvation. Enki intervened. The text states he instructed Atrahasis, command the people to cease all offerings to the gods except to Nisaba, goddess of grain. Let all worship, all sacrifice, all devotion focus on her alone. The strategy was to leverage Nisaba's influence within the divine council. When she alone received worship, she would advocate for ending the famine to restore normal cult practice. It worked. The famine was lifted. Humanity recovered. Enlil tried again, this time through drought. Let the rain clouds be withheld. Let the flood of water from underground cease. Let the fields become white with salt. The ecological description is precise. Salination of soil from over-irrigation was a genuine problem in ancient Sumer. The text describes 7 years of drought. Humans suffered. But again Enki intervened, instructing focus of worship on Adad, god of storms. Adad's advocacy ended the drought. Humanity recovered. The text then describes Enlil's frustration and his demand for a final solution. The people have become too numerous. Their noise disturbs me. Let us bind ourselves by oath. Let the assembly of the gods decree the flood. Let no god warn humanity. Let them perish completely, and let silence return. The tablet records the council's agreement. Each god swore an oath, binding themselves to silence. The flood would come. No warning would be given. Humanity would be caught unprepared and would perish. This is described as formal procedure, a unanimous vote followed by binding oaths. Enki swore the oath, but he then spoke, not to Atrahasis, but to the reed wall of Atrahasis' house. The text is explicit. Enki opened his mouth and spoke to the wall. Reed wall, listen to my words. Dismantle your house, build a boat. Abandon possessions, seek life. Reject goods, save living things. Bring into the boat seed of all living creatures. The boat you will build, her dimensions shall be equal, her length and breadth shall correspond. The instructions are extraordinarily detailed. The boat's dimensions, 10 dozen cubits in height, 10 dozen cubits in width, creating a cube-shaped vessel. The materials, the structure, 7 decks, divided into 9 compartments. The cargo animals, craftspeople, family, supplies, and the timing, 7 days to build then. Seal it before the storm arrives. This is not vague prophetic language. This is engineering specification. Atrahasis built the boat according to these specifications. He loaded it with animals, all the birds of the sky, cattle of the field, craftsmen of every kind. The text includes detail that feels observational. The animals came in pairs. The wild creatures of the steppe entered. There is a procedural quality, a sense that this is describing something someone witnessed or believed occurred exactly this way. The flood came. The text describes the Anunnaki releasing the storm. Adad thundered within the cloud. Shulat and Hanish went before. The heralds went over mountain and plain. Erigel tore out the posts. Ninurta went forward, making the dikes overflow. The Anunnaki raised torches, setting the land ablaze with their flare. Each god is assigned a specific function in releasing the flood. This is coordinated action, not natural disaster. The description of the flood itself is harrowing. The people could not see each other in the catastrophe. Even the gods were terrified by the flood. They retreated. They climbed to the highest heaven of Anu. The gods cowered like dogs, crouching against the outer wall. This suggests even the Anunnaki had not fully anticipated the flood's intensity. What they unleashed was beyond their expectation. Most striking is the description of divine regret. The goddess Nintu wept. How could I speak evil in the assembly of the gods? How could I consent to the destruction of my people? The Anunnaki wept with her. The gods sat weeping. Their lips were parched with thirst. The text portrays the gods as horrified witnesses to their own decision, unable to reverse what they had set in motion. The flood lasted 7 days and 7 nights. When it subsided, the text describes Atrahasis opening the boat and discovering a world scoured clean, all of mankind had returned to clay. The landscape was flat as a rooftop. Atrahasis performed sacrifices. The smoke rose to heaven. The gods smelled the sweet savour. The gods gathered like flies over the offering. The image is simultaneously pathetic and telling. The gods, who had sought to eliminate the noise of humanity, now crowded desperately around the one human who survived because they were hungry for his offerings. Enlil arrived and saw the boat. The text records his immediate reaction. How did any man escape? No man was to survive the destruction. He identified Enki as the source of the warning. The confrontation between the brothers is documented. Enlil said to Enki, "You, wisest of the gods, how did you allow this to happen? You made me swear an oath, yet a man has survived." Enki's defense is technical. "I did not reveal the secret of the great gods. I let Atrahasis see a dream, and thus he understood the secret." This is procedural evasion. Enki claims he did not directly violate the oath because he spoke to a wall, not a human, and any understanding Atrahasis gained was through interpretation, not direct revelation. The text describes extended debate within the council. Some gods supported Enlil's position. An oath was sworn and should have been honoured regardless of technicalities. Others supported Enki's position. The oath prohibited direct warning, but did not prohibit indirect communication. Still others, including Nintu and several goddesses, argued that the flood itself was unjust. Humanity's crime did not merit total extinction. The resolution is compromise, not consensus. Enlil accepted that humanity survived, but imposed permanent restrictions. The text lists these. Let there be a third category among the people, women who do not bear children. Let demons snatch babies from the laps of mothers. Let there be priestesses who are forbidden to bear children. These are population control measures, ensuring humanity can never again reach pre-flood numbers. Enki accepted these restrictions as preferable to extinction. The text concludes with acknowledgement that a new relationship now existed between gods and humans. Humans would continue, but within strict limits, and the gods would continue receiving worship, but would never again attempt total erasure. The betrayal question is suspended in this resolution. From Enlil's perspective, Enki broke a sworn oath, violated council consensus, and subverted divine authority to impose his own judgment. Enki's action was ultimate betrayal, placing personal preference above collective decision and cosmic law. From Enki's perspective, Enlil's decision to destroy humanity was the betrayal. He had created humans under Enlil's supervision, at the council's request, to solve a divine problem. Having served their purpose, humanity was to be discarded like used tools. Enki's betrayal was actually loyalty to his creations, to justice, and to a future where divine and human worlds coexisted rather than one erasing the other. The tablets do not resolve this. Both positions are documented with their supporting arguments. The text presents divine governance as capable of fundamental moral disagreement, where even sworn oaths cannot produce unity when core principles conflict. What remains clear is the consequence: a world reduced to near extinction, a divine council fractured by the conflict, and permanent distrust between Enlil and Enki that would colour all subsequent divine decisions. The flood was not the end of the world, but it was the end of the possibility that the Anunnaki could govern with unified authority. After the flood, every major decision would be contested, every oath would be examined for loopholes, and every god would remember that the council had once agreed to something terrible, then disagreed on whether defying it was crime or courage. The ultimate betrayal may not have been Enlil's decree or Enki's defiance. It may have been the system itself, a governance structure where such decisions could be made, where total erasure was procedurally possible, and where the only defence against that possibility was individual gods choosing to violate their oaths in service of higher principles that the system itself did not recognise. Divine Abandonment, the Curse of Agade. The tablets describing the fall of the Akkadian Empire provide a different model of divine betrayal, not direct conflict between gods, but collective withdrawal of protection from a human city that violated sacred boundaries. The composition known as the Curse of Agade, preserved across multiple Old Babylonian copies, presents this abandonment as formal procedure triggered by specific offence. The text opens by describing Agade's rise to glory. When Enlil frowned on the Eka, when he cast his eye in anger on the land of Sumer, when he pronounced the utter destruction of Kish, at that moment the kingship of Sumer was carried off to Agade. When Inanna moved to Agade, she took with her the divine powers. She made the city surpass all others. This is credited prosperity. Enlil withdrew favour from Kish. Inanna transferred her protection to Agade. Under her patronage, Agade became wealthy, powerful, and cultured. The text describes the city's abundance in specific detail, granaries overflowing, trade goods from distant lands filling the markets, even old women receiving gold, and young women receiving lapis lazuli, symbols of economic prosperity extending to all social classes. The shift begins when omens turn against the city. For 7 years, omens were not observed. Diviners did not examine the entrails. Prophets did not speak. The gods did not answer prayers. This is divine silence, a withdrawal of communication that left Agade's leaders unable to determine divine will. King Naram-Sin, according to the text, responded to this silence with increasing desperation, performing rituals, making offerings, seeking any response. None came. Finally, Naram-Sin made a decision the text describes as catastrophic. He mustered his troops. Like a bandit, he smashed the door of the house. Like a bandit, he went to meet Enlil in his own territory. Naram-Sin led an armed force into Nippur, entered the Echo Temple, Enlil's residence, and Sumer's sacred centre, and looted it. The text provides inventory-style detail. Its silver, its gold, its copper, its lapis lazuli, its treasure he loaded onto boats. The treasure of Nippur he removed. The waters of the Euphrates he muddied with the debris. This is documented pillage, described with the precision of a losses report. The consequence was not immediate divine wrath. Instead, the text describes formal procedure. Enlil did not personally punish Agade. He withdrew his protection and invited other gods to curse it. Enlil brought out of his storehouse the fates. He said to the great gods, "Come, let Agade be destroyed. Let its future be as dark as night. Let no one remember its name." The great gods agreed. They approved his command. What follows is a litany of specific curses, each delivered by a different deity. Ninurta cursed the city's military strength. Let your weapons be broken. Let your army be scattered. Let your soldiers be unable to lift their hands against enemies. Utu cursed agriculture. Let your fertile fields grow weeds. Let your well-watered gardens produce brine. Let your harvest be dust. Enki cursed fresh water. Let your rivers bring no flood. Let your canals carry no water. Let thirst crack your lips. The pattern continues through multiple deities. Each curse is specific, targeted, and binding. This is not emotional outburst. This is procedural allocation of punishments by domain. Each god curses the aspect of civilization under their jurisdiction. The text describes the execution of these curses, the Gutians, a people who know no inhibitions, with human instincts but canine intelligence, entered Agade. It was as if a flood had come. Nothing escaped. Everything was destroyed. The old women did not say, "Alas, my silver." The old men did not say, "Alas, my gold." They said only, "Alas, my life." Archaeological evidence aligns with this narrative in interesting ways. The Akkadian Empire, which had dominated Mesopotamia under Sargon and reached its height under Naram-Sin, collapsed suddenly around 2200 BCE. Agade itself, the capital city, has never been definitively located by archaeologists. Some scholars suggest this is because the city was so thoroughly destroyed that no significant remains survived. The Sumerian king list records that after Agade fell, who was king, who was not king. Before kingship, moved to Uruk. The Curse of Agadi presents this collapse as the result of divine abandonment triggered by temple violation. Naram Sin's offence was not political or military, it was ritual. He violated the sacred centre of Sumer, the place that connected heaven and earth, the residence of the god who granted kingship itself. By doing so, he broke the compact that allowed human civilization to exist under divine protection. The text's theological framework suggests that human cities required divine favour to prosper. This favour was not automatic. It was granted based on proper ritual observance, respect for sacred boundaries, and fulfilment of obligations. When a king violated these requirements, the gods had procedural recourse, withdraw protection, invite curse allocation by relevant deities, and allow natural and human forces to destroy what divine protection had previously preserved. This is government by contract. The gods provided protection and prosperity in exchange for worship and respect. Breach the contract, lose the protection. The system is transactional and procedural, not emotional or arbitrary. The concept of divine abandonment appears across multiple Mesopotamian texts. The lament, the cursing of a god, is part of a broader genre called city laments, compositions describing cities destroyed after their patron deity chose to leave. These texts describe the departure as formal. The god announces their decision, removes their divine presence, sometimes called the me or divine essence of the place, and withdraws to heaven while the city burns. The lament for for example, describes how Ningal pleaded with Enlil and Anu to spare her city, but was overruled. She was commanded to abandon and she obeyed. I wept before them, but they did not remove that judgment. Finally, I had to leave my city. The city fell to the Elamites shortly after. This pattern suggests that divine protection was understood as active, ongoing intervention. Without it, human cities were vulnerable to natural disasters, invading armies, internal collapse, and environmental catastrophe. The gods were not distant observers. They were administrators whose presence stabilized fragile urban systems. Remove the administrator, and the system fails. The abandonment of Agade, therefore, was not betrayal in the sense of broken promise. There was no promise that divine favour would continue if sacred boundaries were violated. It was betrayal in the sense of relationship severed. The gods who had made Agade great chose collectively to unmake it. They did so through formal process, withdrawal, curse allocation, and permission granted to destructive forces. Naram Sin's offence was individual, one king's decision to loot one temple. The punishment was collective, an entire city and its population destroyed, its name nearly erased, its ruins left as a warning. The disproportionality raises questions the tablets acknowledge but do not resolve. The composition includes voices within the text questioning the severity. What did the people do? Why should they suffer for their king's crime? No answer is provided. The text documents that the gods decided collectively, that the curses were allocated by proper authority, and that the outcome was total destruction. Whether this was just is left for the reader to determine. What is clear is that divine favour, once withdrawn, was extraordinarily difficult to restore. A god never recovered. Kingship moved elsewhere, and the memory of a god's fall became a teaching text. Copies were made and studied for over 1,000 years after the city's destruction, suggesting that each generation of scribes and priests examined it as a case study in what happens when sacred boundaries are violated. The betrayal of Agade was mutual. Naram Sin betrayed the divine order by violating Enlil's house, and the gods betrayed the people of Agade by destroying them for their king's offence. Neither party emerges from the text as innocent, but the power differential is absolute. Human kings could violate divine property, but gods could erase cities. The system ensured that in any ultimate conflict, divine authority would prevail. The lesson, repeated in city lament after city lament, was that human civilization existed at divine pleasure, not by human right. Prosperity was granted, not earned. And what was granted could be withdrawn through procedure as formal as the procedure that granted it originally. Patterns across time. When gods betrayed gods. Having examined individual instances of conflict, deception, and betrayal among the Anunnaki, patterns begin to emerge. These are not random incidents or isolated narratives. They form a consistent structure, a documented system of governance that function through division of authority, procedural obligation, and mechanisms for both cooperation and subversion. The first pattern is jurisdictional. Nearly every major conflict described in the tablets involves a dispute over authority boundaries. Enlil and Enki compete over humanity's fate because humans exist in Enlil's territory but were created by Enki's design. Inanna takes the me from Enki because she believes her city deserves them more than his. Anzu steals the Tablet of Destinies because it grants authority over all territories. Ereshkigal executes Inanna for entering the underworld without permission. Nergal violates underworld boundaries and must be incorporated into its governance. The pattern suggests that the divine world these tablets describe was not unified under single authority. It was divided into domains, geographical depths, underworld, sky, functional Jala, rain, war, wisdom, love, death, and institutional specific cities and temple. Each domain had a primary authority who held jurisdiction within it, but whose power was limited at its boundaries. This division created constant tension. When domains overlapped, or when actions in one domain affected another, disputes arose. The tablets describe no supreme authority willing to resolve these disputes definitively. Anu, as nominal king of the gods, is described as distant and rarely intervening. When he does intervene, as in the Adapa incident or the Anzu recovery, he adjudicates between parties but does not impose unity. He allows tensions to persist, conflicts to continue, and domains to remain separate. The second pattern is procedural. Betrayals in the tablets are almost never spontaneous emotional failures. They are violations of specific protocols, sworn oaths, Enki's fawn, hospitality customs, Nau's failure to end, sacred boundaries, Nan's temple, jurisdictional limits, Nana's underworld descent, or property rights, Anzu's theft, Inanna's mere appropriation. Each violation has a defined consequence. Oath-breaking requires the oath-breaker to accept restrictions on what they protected. Enki accepts population controls on humanity. Hospitality violation demands the violator descend to face judgment rule must answer to Ereshkigal. Boundary violation results in jurisdiction being enforced. Ereshkigal executes Inanna. Theft triggers recovery efforts and, if successful, punishment of the thief Anzu is killed. Property appropriation is permanent if the appropriator can defend possession. Na keeps the May. The system has structure. It operates according to rules the tablets document with careful consistency across centuries of texts. When those rules are violated, consequences follow. But the consequences are not moral judgments, they are procedural responses. The tablets do not describe the gods as good or evil. They describe them as authorities who follow defined protocols and who respond to violations according to established precedent. The third pattern is irreversibility. Once a betrayal occurs and its consequences unfold, the tablets describe no mechanism for restoration of the previous state. Humanity remains mortal after Adapa's refusal. Immortality is not offered again. The Me remain in Uruk after Inanna's transfer. They do not return to Eridu. Dumuzi alternates between surface and underworld after Inanna's substitution. No release is granted. A god is not rebuilt after its divine abandonment. The curses remain binding. This irreversibility suggests that the divine world operates with historical consequence. Decisions shape subsequent reality permanently. There is no reset, no forgiveness that erases, no reconciliation that restores what was broken. The gods must live with the outcomes of their conflicts. Just as humans must live with the outcomes of divine conflicts affecting them. The fourth pattern is selective loyalty. The tablets do not describe the Anunnaki as a unified faction opposed to chaos or evil. They describe them as individuals with competing interests who form temporary alliances, betray those alliances when convenient, and prioritize their own jurisdictional authority over collective good. Enki prioritizes humanity's survival over oath-keeping. Inanna prioritizes Uruk's power over Eridu's traditional authority. Nergal prioritizes his personal pride over diplomatic protocol. Ereshkigal prioritizes underworld sovereignty over family bonds. Each god acts according to their individual judgment of what serves their interests or principles, and those judgments frequently conflict. The tablets document no divine council meeting where this fragmentation is resolved. Instead, they document ongoing negotiation, constant tension, and acceptance that divine authority will remain divided, competitive, and unstable. The fifth pattern is human cost. Nearly every divine betrayal described in the tablets imposes consequences on humanity. The flood kills nearly everyone because of Enlil and Enki's conflict. Mortality persists because of Enki's deception of Adapa. Agade is destroyed because of Enlil's withdrawal following Naram-Sin's offence. Enkidu dies because of divine tribunal judgment on actions Gilgamesh initiated. Dumuzi cycles through the underworld because of Inanna's choice of substitute. Humans are collateral damage in divine disputes. Their survival depends on which gods prevail in which conflicts. When Enki wins against Enlil, humanity survives but diminished. When Enlil wins against Agade, the city is erased. When Ereshkigal wins against Inanna, Dumuzi pays the price. The tablets do not present this as unjust. They present it as inevitable. Humans exist within divine governance systems. When those systems conflict, humans are affected. There is no mechanism for human appeal, no court where humans can argue their case, no protection from divine decisions made for divine reasons. The pattern suggests that human civilization in the worldview these tablets express was fundamentally precarious, dependent on divine favour that could be withdrawn, vulnerable to divine conflicts they could not influence, and shaped by betrayals among authorities they did not choose and could not replace. Mainstream scholarly interpretation treats these patterns as mythological frameworks created by humans to explain natural phenomena, political changes, and social structures. By this reading, the patterns exist because they reflect human experience of instability, conflict, and authority, projected onto divine figures who act out human dramas at cosmic scale. An alternative reading, less common but consistent with how the tablets describe their own purpose, is that these patterns were documented because the scribes believed they were observing real governance conflicts. The division of jurisdiction, the procedural responses to violations, the irreversibility of consequences, the selective loyalty, and the human cost were features of the system they lived under. They recorded betrayals among the Anunnaki not as creative fiction, but as explanatory documentation. This is why the flood happened, why mortality persists, why cities fall, why kingship moves, why we suffer. Whether the scribes were correct is a question the evidence cannot definitively answer, but what is clear from the patterns is that these texts were composed with consistency, maintained across centuries, and treated by their own tradition as serious documentation of governance rather than entertaining fantasy. The patterns across time reveal a system where betrayal was not aberration but feature, where divine authority was always contested, where sacred oaths could be broken, when principles conflicted with procedures, and where the greatest powers in heaven operated in tension that could not be resolved, only managed through ongoing negotiation and occasional violence. If these were myths, they were myths that documented systemic dysfunction with unusual precision. If they were records of authority structures fundamentally incapable of unity. Either way, they are texts that describe betrayal not as exceptional crisis, but as the ordinary operation of divine governance, a system where trust was tactical, loyalty was conditional, and every god knew that consensus today could fracture tomorrow, leaving consequences that would endure forever. 3 interpretations: myth, metaphor, or memory. The evidence assembled across these chapters invites interpretation, but the tablets themselves do not provide explicit guidance on how they should be read. Ancient Mesopotamian texts lack the self-referential commentary common in later literary traditions. There are no authorial asides explaining this is symbolic or this actually happened. The texts present events, record procedures, and document outcomes. How we understand those presentations depends on the framework we bring to the reading. 3 primary interpretive frameworks have dominated scholarly discussion, each with supporting arguments and each with limitations. Interpretation 1, pure mythology. This is the mainstream academic position. By this reading, the Sumerian texts describing Anunnaki conflicts are imaginative narratives created by humans to explain natural phenomena, justify political structures, and explore existential questions through storytelling. The flood narrative, for example, is understood as mythological explanation for catastrophic flooding events that did occur in Mesopotamian history. Geological evidence confirms major floods around 2900 BCE. The story of Enki warning Atrahasis functions to explain why humanity survived because one god chose to preserve them. This is more emotionally satisfying than some people happen to be on high ground, so the myth persists and develops elaborate detail. By this framework, the procedural language, the councils, oaths, jurisdictional disputes, reflects the human political structures of ancient Sumer projected onto divine figures. Humans knew kingship through councils of elders, city governance through competing jurisdictions, and law through oaths and treaties. They imagined their gods operating similarly because they had no other template for describing authority. The betrayals documented in the texts by this interpretation are not historical records, but literary devices exploring moral questions. When is oath breaking justified? What obligations do creators owe their creations? How should authority respond when consensus fractures? These are questions every human society faces. Mythology provides a space to examine them at remove, using divine characters whose actions carry no direct consequence for the listener, allowing exploration of ideas too dangerous to debate openly using human examples. This interpretation is supported by the fact that similar flood myths, creation accounts, and divine conflict narratives appear across many ancient cultures: Sumerian, Akkadian, Hebrew, Greek, Hindu, and others. The commonality suggests these are human universal themes expressed through culturally specific imagery, not documentation of unique historical events. However, this interpretation struggles with certain features of the texts. The extraordinary procedural detail, specific catalogue numbers for tablets, exact dimensions for boats, precise curse formulations, detailed ritual specifications, seems excessive if the goal is merely symbolic storytelling. Metaphors do not typically require engineering specifications, and the consistency across centuries of texts, across different city-states with competing political interests, is difficult to explain if each scribe was freely inventing. Interpretation 2. Encoded wisdom. A second framework suggests the tablets encode philosophical and spiritual wisdom through narrative form. By this reading, the Anunnaki represent principles rather than persons, Enlil as order and law, Enki as wisdom and compassion, Inanna as desire and power, Ereshkigal as death and necessity. The conflicts between these principles are eternal and irresolvable. Order sometimes demands destruction, wisdom sometimes must deceive to preserve life. Adapa, Atrahasis. Desire drives acquisition that destabilizes existing structures, me. Death claims even those with divine power, Nawun. These are not historical events, but permanent existential tensions embedded in reality itself. By this framework, the procedural language is pedagogical. The tablets teach by example. Here is how authority works. Here are consequences of oath breaking. Here is what happens when domains are violated. The detailed specifications reinforce the lessons: precision in ritual, attention to protocol, respect for boundaries. Students studying these texts would learn not just stories but structures for understanding cosmic and social order. This interpretation is supported by the fact that Mesopotamian scribal schools used many of these texts as teaching material. Student tablets exist with portions of Atrahasis, Gilgamesh, and other compositions copied as exercises. The texts were pedagogical tools, suggesting their purpose was educational, not purely historical. Additionally, some texts contain explicit wisdom framing. The Epic of Gilgamesh concludes with meditation on mortality and legacy. The Descent of Inanna has been read as initiatory wisdom, the stripping away of power at each gate as metaphor for spiritual purification required to face death and rebirth. The Adapa myth can be read as teaching about the proper human relationship to divine knowledge. Receive what is offered, but do not grasp for what is withheld. However, this interpretation also has limitations. If the texts are primarily wisdom literature, why include such specific historical details, names of kings from the Sumerian king list, references to specific cities and temples that could be visited, catalogue-style documentation of objects and procedures? Wisdom literature in other traditions, verbs, Analects, Upanishads, tends toward abstraction, not specificity. The Sumerian tablets operate differently. Interpretation 3, historical documentation. The third framework, least common in mainstream academia but worth serious consideration, is that the tablets document the scribes' genuine attempt to record events they believed occurred, authorities they believed existed, and conflicts they believed shaped their world's history. By this reading, the Anunnaki were understood by ancient Mesopotamians as real governing authorities, whether understood as highly advanced humans, non-human intelligences, or something not clearly defined in their taxonomy. These authorities established cities, taught civilization, ruled through councils, and conflicted over jurisdictional and philosophical disagreements. The scribes recorded these conflicts using the best language they had available, the language of kingship, law, and administration. They described divine councils because they believed councils occurred. They documented oath-breaking because they believed oaths were sworn and broken. They catalogued consequences because they believed those consequences followed from specific decisions made by specific authorities. The flood narrative, by this reading, documents an actual decision by governing authorities to reduce human population through a catastrophic event, and one authority's decision to ensure survival by warning a faithful servant. Whether the mechanism was natural disaster or technological remains unspecified, the tablets describe the decision and the outcome, not the mechanism. The procedural language is not metaphorical but technical. The scribes documented procedures because accuracy mattered. Future generations needed to know how authority operated, what triggered divine response, what protocols governed the relationship between human and divine realms. This was not entertainment, it was necessary knowledge for survival. This interpretation is supported by the tablet's self-presentation as documentation, not creative fiction. The Sumerian king list presents antediluvian and post-diluvian dynasties with the same grammatical structure, suggesting the scribes considered both categories equally historical. The Atrahasis epic describes the flood using the same narrative style as it describes humanity's creation and the Ajiji rebellion, all treated as sequential historical events. Additionally, the tablet's consistency across competing political contexts is easier to explain if they're documenting a shared historical framework rather than inventing parallel mythologies. Texts from Uruk, Nippur, Eridu and Lagash, cities with conflicting political interests, maintain consistent core narratives about the Anunnaki, their hierarchy, their conflicts, and humanity's relationship to them. This is more consistent with documented shared history than with independent invention. However, this interpretation faces substantial challenges. Modern science has no framework for understanding the Anunnaki as described. Beings with lifespans of tens of thousands of years, abilities to control weather and cosmic forces, physical existence in both heaven and earth. Archaeology has not discovered technology or structures that would support the capabilities these texts attribute to the Anunnaki, and the tablets describe events like Inanna hanging from a hook in the underworld that seem clearly metaphysical rather than physical. Defenders of this interpretation note that absence of archaeological evidence is not evidence of absence. Most of ancient Mesopotamia remains unexcavated, and what has been excavated represents a tiny fraction of what existed. They also note that if the Anunnaki were technologically advanced, we might not recognize their artifacts as such, especially after 4 millennia of erosion and recycling of materials. Finally, they argue that modern scientific frameworks may be insufficient to evaluate claims about non-human intelligence operating in ancient history. The absence of a framework is not proof of impossibility. Integration and remaining questions. These three interpretations are not entirely mutually exclusive. Texts can function simultaneously as mythology, wisdom literature, and documentation. A scribe could believe they are documenting real events, while also recognizing the wisdom encoded in those events and the mythological power the narratives carry. What none of these interpretations adequately explains is why the tablets maintain such extraordinary procedural consistency across centuries, while simultaneously describing events that seem impossible by modern standards. Pure mythology should vary more significantly between city-states and time periods. Pure wisdom literature should abstract more and specify less. Pure documentation should feel less mythological and more historical record-like. The Sumerian tablets occupy an unusual middle ground. They feel like documentation, they function as wisdom literature, and they operate as mythology. This may be because these categories are modern distinctions that the ancient scribes did not recognize. They had one category, important knowledge, that needed to be preserved accurately. Whether that knowledge was historical memory, encoded teaching, imaginative exploration, or some combination remains genuinely uncertain. The tablets themselves do not resolve the question. They present evidence, they document patterns, they record betrayals with consistent procedural framing. The viewer, or in the original context, the reader, is left to interpret. And that may be intentional, because if these texts were meant to shape understanding of authority, power, loyalty and betrayal, ambiguity serves the pedagogical function. The reader must think, must evaluate evidence, must form judgment without being told what conclusion to reach. In this way, the tablets function not as propaganda which tells you what to think, but as education which teaches you how to think. The evidence is provided, the patterns are documented, the interpretive framework is left to you. The question that remains: the museum vault remains at 68 degrees. The tablet CBS 10673 sits in its archival box, its cuneiform impressions unchanged since a Sumerian scribe pressed them into soft clay 40 centuries ago. The words it records have not altered. They describe a flood, a warning given against consensus, a decision by one authority to defy the judgment of another. What has changed is everything around those words. The cities that once read them have crumbled, the temples that once housed them are dust, the civilization that created them ended 3,000 years ago. But the tablet endures, along with hundreds like it, waiting in museums and university collections across the world, preserving accounts of betrayals that shaped, or were believed to shape, the foundation of human history. We have walked through those accounts. The jurisdictional war between Enlil and Enki that fractured divine authority at its core. The deception of Adapa that cost humanity immortality. The transfer of the me from Eridu to Uruk through cleverness and alcohol. The theft of the Tablet of Destinies that threatened to overthrow cosmic order. The sister against sister execution in the underworld and the substitute system that followed. The forced marriage between Nergal and Ereshkigal that resolved through violence what diplomacy could not. The flood decision that divided the divine council and revealed that even sworn oaths could be broken when principle conflicted with procedure. The divine abandonment of Agadi that erased an empire. The patterns across all these accounts that reveal a system where betrayal was not exception but structure, where authority operated through contestation, where loyalty was tactical, and where consequences were irreversible. The question suspended in the cool air of museum vaults and academic journals is what these tablets mean. Are they mythology, human imagination, exploring universal themes through divine characters? Are they wisdom literature, encoded philosophical teachings about authority, loyalty, and consequence? Or are they documentation, the best attempts of ancient scribes to record the governance conflicts of authorities they believed were real? The evidence supports all three interpretations to varying degrees, and the tablets themselves provide no definitive answer. They present procedures, document conflicts, and record outcomes with consistent linguistic registers and sustained detail across centuries of textual tradition. But they describe events that strain modern scientific frameworks and employ language that can be read symbolically, literally, or procedurally, depending on the reader's approach. Perhaps the question of which interpretation is correct is less important than what the texts accomplish, regardless of their ontological status. They preserve accounts of authority in conflict, of systems designed to prevent betrayal failing to do so, of consequences that could not be undone, and of survivors adapting to realities shaped by decisions made in divine councils they could not influence. If these are myths, they are myths that documented systemic dysfunction with unusual precision. If they are wisdom literature, they talk by showing rather than stating, allowing readers to observe conflicts and draw conclusions about authority, loyalty, and the costs of both. If they are documentation, they recorded a cosmos governed by divided authorities whose conflicting judgments shape the conditions of human existence in ways that persist as cultural memory 4 millennia later. What remains undeniable is that these tablets were important enough to be copied, studied, and preserved for over 1,000 years of active Mesopotamian civilization, then excavated and translated by modern scholars who recognize their significance even when uncertain of their meaning. The accounts they contain of Anunnaki betrayals, whether historical, metaphorical, or imaginative, shaped Mesopotamian understanding of power, obligation, and consequence, and through their influence on later traditions, including biblical narratives that adapted Mesopotamian flood accounts, wisdom literature, and creation stories, they continue to shape contemporary understanding of these themes. The scribes who pressed reeds into clay to create these texts believed they were recording something that mattered, something that needed to be remembered accurately, preserved carefully, and transmitted across generations. They succeeded. The tablets endured. The words remain legible. The accounts can still be read. Whether those accounts document betrayals that actually occurred, encode wisdom about betrayal's nature and consequence, or explore betrayal's meaning through imaginative narrative is a question each reader must answer based on the evidence presented and the interpretive framework they find most compelling. What is not uncertain is that betrayal, the violation of trust, the breaking of bonds, the choice of individual judgment over collective consensus, was central to how ancient Mesopotamians understood their world's formation and their civilization's foundations. The gods who gave them writing, law, agriculture, and kingship were the same gods who fought each other, deceived each other, stole from each other, and could not maintain unity even when sworn oaths bound them. Perhaps this was the deepest wisdom the tablets encoded, that authority is always contested, that systems designed to produce order will generate conflict, that even the powerful are bound by consequences of their choices, and that those who inherit worlds shaped by others' betrayals must navigate realities they did not create and cannot fully control. Humanity, according to these accounts, was created to serve, nearly destroyed through divine conflict, preserved by a violation of divine consensus, limited in capacity to prevent future conflicts, and left to build civilization in the shadow of authorities whose unity was permanent fiction and whose divisions were documented fact. If you've been listening through the night, dawn may be approaching wherever you are. If you began at evening, deep night surrounds you now. In the quiet darkness, imagine a scribe 4,000 years ago pressing the final signs into a tablet that would record a betrayal, Enki defying Enlil, Inanna seizing the Me, Nergal threatening Ereshkigal, the council deciding humanity's fate. The scribe's hand was steady, the words were chosen carefully. This needed to be remembered, and it has been. The question of what exactly has been remembered, history, myth, wisdom, or some fusion of all three, remains open. The tablets provide evidence, they document patterns, they preserve accounts, but they do not provide interpretation. That task falls to each generation of readers who encounter these texts and ask what they mean. The betrayals recorded in Sumerian clay may have been divine dramas that shaped human history, or human dramas projected onto divine actors, or wisdom teachings structured as historical narrative. What they undeniably are is an archive of humanity's earliest attempts to document and understand authority's operation, loyalty's price, and betrayal's consequences. The tablets rest in their vaults, their testimony complete but their meaning still contested. 4,000 years after they were written, we are still asking what they record and why it matters. That we continue asking suggests the questions they raise about authority, loyalty, betrayal, and the structures that govern existence remain as unresolved now as when Sumerian scribes first pressed reeds into clay to document the conflicts of gods who ruled their world and shaped their fate. If this exploration has resonated with your own reflections on authority and betrayal, on systems that fail despite intentions, on consequences that cannot be undone, consider leaving a thought about what struck you most deeply. Not for the algorithm, not for engagement metrics, but because these questions the tablets raise are worth continuing to explore, generation after generation, each bringing new perspectives to evidence that has outlasted the civilization that created it. The scribe who created CBS 2673 is 4,000 years dead. The gods described in the tablet, if they existed, are silent now, their temples ruins, their cults ended. But the words remain. The betrayals recorded in those words remain documented. And the question of what those betrayals mean, what they teach, what they reveal, what they preserve, remains open, waiting for each new reader to examine the evidence and reach their own conclusion. The question remains, and perhaps that is exactly as it should be.